The Topcon fixation assembly can be fairly complicated, and to get to the parts it takes a little bit of creativity. It's like a puzzle, and if your socket assembly that the bulb is in, if the wires in there break, which they can often, then you'll have to get in there to resolder the wires. And to get there, you have to kind of take off what you can. If you needed to get inside here, but there's no way to get to it, so you have to look around to see where is the available screw that you can start with, and it looks like this is the only one that's visible that we can get to. So you have to start with whatever is accessible. You could unscrew this, but you can only go so far. So you're going to have to take this assembly apart, and everything is held together by a screw, a spring, and a stopper. These things they're not electrically, they just hold. They keep things from turning further than they should, because if it's a wire going to it, it can only turn so much before the wire would break. So these are just stoppers. They're not electrically part of the equation. So you would have to, the hardest part is taking it apart. You have to unscrew the screw to get to the spring, to get to the stopper, and to pull those out. Here's one that's left in. This is a screw we would only have access to, and inside it you can see the spring and the stopper that's going up against the arm. So you're going to have to remove that screw, pull those pieces out so that you can separate these. Now you may be fortunate, and by just releasing the screw, unscrewing the screw, everything will come out. But many times it doesn't. So we'll see what this one is like. Be careful of that spring. See, the spring is attached to there, but the stopper is still in there, and it's got to come out a little bit so that we can separate these. And what you can do is vibrate it, and maybe it will fall out. All it has to do is fall a little bit to be able to separate. If it doesn't separate, it means it's still too far in. So other ways you can try to pull that pin up is get some kind of sharp instrument and try to reach in and pull that stopper. Okay, we were able to get that. So we didn't have to pull it all the way out, just up enough to release the shaft underneath it. And you'll see what happens many times is this screw will, from overuse, the top of the screw head will disintegrate or break, and that screw will have to be replaced if it's in bad shape. This one happens to be in good shape, but oftentimes, because it's used so often and it goes to the extremes, this screw head is in very bad shape. Okay, now that we've got that separated, we can go deeper, and now we can turn this part of the assembly. And you have to be careful. Well, if the wire's already broke, it's okay if the socket turns. But if it wasn't broken, you wouldn't want to turn that socket while you're unscrewing this, so you might want to even put your bulb back in there to hold it steady while you're unscrewing it. If it starts turning, the whole wire is going to turn. This one's staying put. So this is the cap. It's got threads that screw onto here. And this is your little socket assembly that the wire is soldered onto. Now if it's broke, it's just going to pull out. And these wires, you would have to fish them back through here 90 degrees to get to that socket assembly. I'm pulling it out. This one is still attached, so this one was in good shape, but many times these wires will be broken for whatever reason, and you'll have to resolder them. But sometimes you can't, there's not enough wire to be able to pull through like I've done this. So you've got to pull wire through your flange pipe. You've got to pull some wire through there so that you can open up your assembly and get to that wire. And you might be able to, this is just a little cover, it can slide off, but you'll have to try to pull wire through your chinrest and get some space to be able to pull your wire out enough to resolder. And this is what the socket looks like. This is a new one. It's nice and clean, but it has a couple little pins that you would solder the wire to, and once you soldered the wire, you need to put some insulating material around it so that the wires don't touch one another. So you can put some silicone or something there. And after it dries, you could put it back together. But it's the same thing on here. If you needed to take this apart, it's the same thing. There's a screw, a spring, and a stopper. And that is also, sometimes that little screw inside here gets worn out. See, this is your flange pipe, and it also has a screw, and the screw is 1.4 by 2. Everything is in millimeters, so it's a very, very small screw. It's the same screw as going in here as is going in here. The stop screw, the stopper pin, rides this track until it hits the stopper screw, and then it won't. That keeps it from turning it further. And this stopper is somewhat hollow inside, and the screw fits inside it. It's not a solid piece of brass. It's like a little canister, and the spring sticks inside that little canister, and then the screw has a little indentation in it where the spring also rides inside. So it's all a nice tight little assembly there. So might be kind of hard to get to. If you wanted to get more room, you could, on your chin rest, take these screws out so you can pull your fixation wire out, which I've done here. And then I squeezed this grounding plug. I squeezed it so it would go inside the pipe a little way to get a little bit more room. And I needed to get as much room as I could, because what I wanted to do, which you may or may not want to do, is this came apart, but this is where the wires join here, and so you've got to get as much room as you can to be able to unsolder these wires, and that's where the thin wires go, and that's part of your fixation if you were traveling that far back. So if you wanted to do it like the factory, you pull your wire through, unsolder these wires, and then you could work with everything, and then when you're done, put it all back together and pull your wires through and make it like it was originally. So I know it can be confusing, and it's not easy, especially if the parts aren't coming apart very easily. But if they do, it's not that bad. And while you're in here, you want to put a little bit of thick grease, and what we would recommend is putting a little bit of number 4 of the hog stripe. It's a real thick grease, and that gives it a little bit of tension, so that when you're turning it, it's going to stay more so than if there's no tension. It might just fall once you have it up. So you're going to want to try to put some thick, just a little bit of grease to give it that tension. And the same with this. This also comes apart. If you take this screw out here, this assembly will come apart. This will come apart. This safety screw rides in here, and it keeps it from coming out of this holder. And your wire would go through here. And see, you only want it to be able to turn like 90 degrees, because you turn it anymore and you're going to start cutting your wire. So, and there's a little insulation ring in here that needs to be there, that should also protect your wires of your socket. And it's fairly intricate, but it can be done. And if the fixation is important for you or the doctor, then you're going to have to try to go for it. But if it's not that important, you might want to just not even mess with it. Of course, here again is a diagram, and also I'll show you the diagram of the upper portion where you have your flange pipe, and there's a nut here that's got a safety screw on the side of it, and once you pull these two screws off this cover, then this assembly comes down, and you can get access to this part of your fixation. There's a nut, and that would be tightened fairly snug, but not too snug, so that the arm won't turn. Then you have a spring, which fits inside the disc, and then you have the receptacle. This plastic sometimes gets broken, and that has its own two little screws here that hold the receptacle, and then you have two screws here that hold this part together. And then you have this nut which screws onto this screw that goes from the top down, and this little nut actually threads into this screw, a Phillips screw. And once everything is tight on here, then there's a little lock screw right on the side, and you would tighten that nut up so it won't get loose. Many times this is too loose, and it's because the spring, it's called a spring, it's sort of like a little flat star looking piece of metal, but if you bend the edges up, all 5 edges, if you bend them up just a little bit, that'll make it into a spring again. And so when you're screwing your nut back on, your spring will have a little bit of tension, and then that determines your tension of your arm. And it's probably okay to have a little bit of tension when you're swinging that arm, so that it doesn't move so quickly. So that might be a different video, but just wanted to show you that part there. So I'll just show you the parts real quick. When it's time to reassemble, after you've soldered your socket onto your wires, or the wires onto your socket, and put the insulation material on there, if you needed to put some grease in here, you could take this safety screw out and you can move it a little bit and you can work some grease in there and try to work it in there so that you can get it in there. You can't pull it all the way out because your wire's going through there. But if you were able to get some in there, then you can put your safety screw back in. Now we can pull our wire. Make sure you have the insulation ring in here. Try to get your wires straight. Hold it into place and then put the cap back on. And look at your socket to make sure it's not turning while you're turning this cap on. If it is, put your bulb back in there to help hold it. Okay. Now we have our wire through here. Now we can continue going in. Depending on how much you took off will determine the sequence. But we know that the last thing we'll be putting in is this screw, because this was the first screw we took out. So because this holder is out, we've got to put that back into place before we install this last piece. So I'm going to put a little bit of number 4 grease on this shaft. I've already got my 1.4 by 2 screw there, safety screw with the short head. It's not sticking up above the track there. It's below flush, so that's what we want. So we're going to have to install this first. We've already got the stopper still halfway in, so that's not going to be in our way. If the stopper weren't there, we'd have to put our stopper in. Okay, we know that's where our screw is, so we're just going to turn it to the side, and now we'll put the spring and cap screw on there and tighten that up. Now if you didn't take this off previously, then it would still be on there, so there wouldn't be an issue. But if there was something wrong and that screw the head was broken and it was turning all the way around, then you would have had to have taken that off and replaced that screw. Okay, we're turning it, and the stop screw is keeping it from going more than 90 degrees. Okay, now we've got our cable straight. We wanted to put a little bit of number 4 grease on this shaft to give it a little bit of tension. That would be good. We've got our safety screw in there. It's below the level, so it's not going to drag. And we've got our cable nice and straight. We're going to pull the slack out as we're closing, pushing it in. Okay. Now we can reinstall our stop spring and cap screw back in. I want to keep a thumb over it so that it doesn't shoot out in case your screwdriver comes off. Okay, that's tight. So we're checking everything. Everything is stopping. We've got a little bit of tension on there, which is good. Everything is turning freely. And we've got our wire through. Now we can put our little insulation on this wire. We're going to push the wire through here before we do the next step. It works better, of course, if the wire is straight. And works better if there's no kinks in this outer layer. But we'll try to fish it in and bend it straight as we're pushing the wire through. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the video so you don't have to watch me threading this through. Next time you see me, the wire will have been pushed through. Okay, I was able to get this insulation back on. I heated it up a little bit, got the kinks out of it, and put a few drops of rim oil inside, and the wires slid in easier. Now, if you needed to service this part of the fixation, there's a small lock screw, and it may have some Loctite or fingernail polish on there holding that screw, so you might have to hit it with some acetone. And it's a very small lock screw. And then you have to unscrew it. And then this is the star, or this is like, they call this a spring, and right now it's fairly flat, so it's not really springing much. So if you needed to tighten the spring, which I usually do, is I will take each fin and with my needle nose just on the tip, find out where I'm going to turn it, and just gently bend these fins up a little bit. And try to get them all the same. So that way it's got more of a spring type. It's not completely flat. I probably would have done these a little bit more, because once I screw the nut back down, it's going to want to push it straight. So that's what's going to be our spring action. So now here's our disc, and if you needed to replace the receptacle, you've got to take this disc out. And you have two small screws here. Take those off, and this screw in the middle comes in from the back and just screws through here. If you replace your receptacle, put it back on and tighten those screws and put your disc back in. And it doesn't need any grease. It will turn. It needs a little tension, and depending on how much tension it had, you might want to put some strong number 4 grease on there to slow it down a little bit. But our spring is going to help us. Now that we've bent the fins a little bit, going to place them bent side down and just make sure it fits inside the groove of your disc. And when we put our nut back on, it might move off, but just before you tighten it all the way, make sure all the fins are on the upper lip of the disc. As you can see, this one, it's down. Because we bent the fins, it's a shorter distance, so you don't have as much touching the outer edges. But once we tighten our nut, we've got to make sure all the fins are on this upper lip. Just wanted to make you aware, when you're tightening this spring down, make sure you're not covering up the holes. And what you could do is just tighten it all the way and then back it off a little bit. Maybe just an 1/8 of a turn. And that might be just enough. And then tighten your screw. And put something on it to cover that hole, to lock it into place. Now you really don't know how much tension you have until you actually put your arm back in. So you could when it's time to put it back on, you put it on and then turn it and see how the tension is. If it's too tight, then you need to loosen that lock screw up and loosen it a little bit more. So you'll just have to see how it is. Okay. Once you have all that, we've put a little bit more spring into our spring by bending the edges to give it a little more tension. And now it's time to either solder now or later, but we need to pull our wire back through here and solder the ends of it, and then pull the slack back out and leave a little space out here, what it was originally, the protective covering, and then put your screws back in.